An 8-year-old girl's innocent question hushed the intimate atmosphere of a charity event, prompting Keanu Reeves to share a deeply personal story about faith, loss, and finding meaning again. What happened next moved everyone in the hall to tears. The hall, hosting a fundraising event for a children's hospital in Los Angeles, was filled with soft lights and low murmurs. The sound of chairs sliding on the floor and occasional gentle laughter created an atmosphere brimming with hope and support. This space, usually reserved for gala dinners or awareness seminars, held a different air this evening. Standing near the modest podium at the front was Keanu Reeves. His calm presence and thoughtful expression were known to everyone in the hall. His usually measured demeanor in front of cameras seemed even softer tonight, perhaps imbued with the purpose of the event. The audience consisted of patients' families, doctors, donors, and compassionate individuals who had come to support the hospital. But amidst the crowd, one small figure stood out with her quiet intensity: 8-year-old Lily. Dressed in her favorite dress, Lily clutched a worn old storybook tightly to her chest. It was a treasure left to her by her beloved late sister. Its pages thinned from reading, its pictures faded. Her mother, seated beside her, had whispered before the event began, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough, and only if you truly mean it from the heart." Lily had nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been rehearsing her question for weeks, scribbling it in her notebook at school, murmuring it to herself in bed at night. This wasn't a question born from childish curiosity, but one that weighed heavily on her soul. As the evening progressed, Keanu Reeves spoke about the hospital's work, the children's struggles, and the importance of hope. His calm, sincere voice captivated the listeners. The crowd listened respectfully, applauding occasionally. The energy, different from the usual excitement of film premieres, was calmer, more heartfelt. Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her book tighter with each passing minute. Finally, the floor opened for questions. A line slowly formed towards the podium. Adults stepped forward to ask about the hospital's needs, volunteering opportunities, or Keanu Reeves's projects. Lily hesitated, her small frame shrinking further into her seat. But with her mother's gentle touch on her shoulder, she knew the moment had come. Her legs trembled as she stood, her heart beating so fast she was sure the entire hall could hear it. The line seemed endless, but as she moved forward, the hall's murmur began to fade. People noticed her, the little girl holding the old book tightly to her chest. Whispers rippled through the crowd. When her turn came, Keanu Reeves looked down towards her. His expression softened momentarily, a gentle curiosity in his eyes. "Yes, young lady, what's your question?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft and encouraging. Lily swallowed hard, gripping her book so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then in a voice that trembled but refused to break, she asked the question that had been echoing in her heart for months. "Mr. Reeves, what does God mean to you?" The room fell into an immediate and complete silence. Eyes darted between the little girl and Keanu Reeves. The weight of her question pressed down on everyone like a tangible force. Reeves, usually known for his thoughtful and measured responses, didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked first at the girl, then at the book in her hands. Something shifted in his demeanor. His silence was almost deafening. This pause felt different from his usual calm, carrying a deeper meaning. His eyes fixed again on the worn book Lily clutched. His lips parted, but no words came out. Lily shifted slightly, her small frame looking even more fragile under the room's collective gaze. Her question wasn't meant to challenge or provoke. It stemmed from a deep yearning to understand something larger than herself. And somehow that sincerity was louder than any debate or shout. The crowd remained hushed. Even the creak of chairs or muffled coughs seemed to vanish, as if the very air held its breath. Finally, Reeves leaned slightly against the podium. "That's a big question," he began, his voice low and perhaps more raw than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." This admission surprised many who knew his reputation for privacy. He looked back at Lily, his expression shifting again, this time to something almost paternal. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God, too. Maybe I didn't go to church, but I'd look up at the sky, watch the stars, and wonder if there was something out there. I tried to understand. He paused, glancing out at the audience as if gauging their reactions. His hands rested on the edge of the podium. Sometimes life throws things at you, he went on, that make you lose all your answers. You question everything. A soft murmur of understanding went through the hall, easing the tension slightly. Lily, however, didn't smile. Her eyes remained fixed on Reeves, waiting for the real answer she had asked for. Reeves leaned forward slightly, his tone softening even more. Life has thrown a lot of challenges my way, too. I've faced losses, very deep losses, times when everything felt meaningless, when I wasn't sure if I could keep going. In those times, he continued, his voice trembling slightly, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Sometimes I thought maybe he had forgotten me altogether. The room was captivated. This wasn't the polished movie lines or prepared speeches they were used to. This was something raw, something real. But I'll tell you this, Reeves said, his voice firming up slightly. Even in my darkest moments, when I thought I was completely alone, I realized this. Faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about trying to believe, even when you can't see it, that there's a meaning, that there's something greater at work. He looked back at Lily. The girl's tight grip on the book had loosened slightly, her wide eyes glistening under the lights. And God, to me, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, is that search for meaning? Maybe that whisper in the silence, the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not done. It's like an invisible hand sometimes, piecing together the broken parts, or just a feeling, walking beside you when you're trying to find your way in the dark. Before the weight of his words could fully settle, Lily's eyes welled up with tears. The crowd began to murmur softly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Lily's tears came quietly at first, a single drop sliding down her cheek. But then, as Reeves's words lingered in the air, her shoulders began to tremble. The whispers in the crowd grew, yet no one dared interrupt the moment. Her mother instinctively leaned over, placing a comforting hand on her back. It's okay, sweetheart, she whispered softly. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. It was something far deeper. Reeves had spoken words she hadn't known she needed to hear, touching a part of her young heart she had long guarded. Reeves seemed to notice her reaction. He took a step away from the podium, his face uncharacteristically open. What's your name? He asked gently. Lily, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. That's a beautiful name, Reeves said with a faint smile. You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest ones to answer, and sometimes those questions remind us of what really matters. Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving Reeves. My sister used to say that too, she said softly. She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him. Something unspoken flickered in Reeves's expression, a mix of admiration and understanding. He took a deep breath, turning his attention back to the crowd. You know, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us? It's not an easy question because it makes us look inward. It makes us face our fears, our doubts, and our flaws. The room was utterly still. For a moment it felt as though Lily wasn't just a little girl holding a book. She was a symbol of something much bigger. Her courage had shifted the tone of the entire evening, transforming a routine charity event into a deeply personal reflection on faith and humanity. Reeves continued, his voice steady but softer than before. We live in a world where we're always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We think power, success, or money will fill the gaps. But they don't. The real answers are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking? He paused, his gaze returning to Lily. Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily. You're wiser than most adults I know. Soft applause broke out from the crowd, but Lily didn't seem to notice. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a look of quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress and looked up at her mother, who smiled back at her with glistening eyes of her own. As the applause subsided, the air in the room was still charged with expectation. It felt like Keanu Reeves' story wasn't quite finished. His eyes scanned the crowd, then rested back on Lily. There was a weight in his expression, something that seemed to come from deeper than politics or public life. When I was a young man, Reeves began, his voice even lower now, there was a time I thought I had it all figured out. I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed, but there was just one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had. He paused, letting the words sink in. The crowd leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. Reeves rarely opened a window into his private life. Some people in my life, he continued, his voice wavering, left too soon. They were very precious, and they had a light about them, a goodness that I couldn't quite understand at the time. But they also had struggles, and sometimes, no matter how much you try to help, it's not enough. His voice broke for a brief moment, and he cleared his throat. When I lost them, I was angry. Angry at myself, angry at fate, the universe, at God. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon. Lily's gaze remained fixed on him, her young face etched with an expression far too wise for her age. Around the room, others looked equally captivated, their expressions a mix of empathy and intrigue. For a long time after that, Reeves continued, I turned away from searching for meaning. I thought if there was a power out there, why would it let that happen? Why take them and leave me behind? He exhaled deeply, his hand gripping the edge of the podium. But then something changed. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw their face in my mind. Maybe not smiling, but peaceful. And it wasn't a voice, but a feeling, like, don't be angry. You have work to do. The crowd was silent, the weight of his words pressing on them. Even the faint sound of cars passing outside seemed to vanish. I realized then, he said, his voice steadying, that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, their purpose was to teach me that. He turned back to Lily, his expression softening. So when you ask me what God means to me, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times. Lily's eyes shimmered again, but this time her tears didn't fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, clutching her sister's book with both hands, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Just as the room seemed to settle into the gravity of his story, someone in the audience raised their hand, breaking the silence and pulling everyone's attention in a new direction. A man near the back of the hall stood slowly, his hand still raised. His rugged face, lined with years of hard work, bore a serious expression. Mr. Reeves, he said, his words measured and deliberate. I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to catch Reeves off guard, but he didn't hesitate for long. He leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze meeting the man's. You know, he began, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy, it's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but it was Lily's voice that broke through next. My sister used to say, faith is like lighting a candle in the dark, she said, her words clear and steady despite her small frame. It doesn't always light up everything, but it shows you the way. Reeves smiled. A genuine, almost tender expression transformed his usually guarded demeanor. Your sister sounds like a very wise person, he said. And she's right. Faith is like a candle's flame. It doesn't always shine the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, lighting your path in ways you can't see. The conversation seemed to breathe new life into the room. People began to nod, share glances, and even whisper quietly to those sitting beside them. What had started as a structured charity event had shifted into something far more personal, a shared reflection on life's challenges, doubts, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair pulled back neatly, raised her hand next. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Reeves stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice soft but steady. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it comes back to you." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Around the room, others looked equally moved, some dabbing at their faces with tissues, others simply sitting in reflective silence. As Reeves' words settled into the hearts of those in the room, it became clear that the evening wasn't just about questions and answers anymore. It was about connection. And what came next would only deepen that bond. The room felt electric now, not with noise, but with a palpable energy of shared vulnerability. Reeves straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. "You know," he said, "there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones, the times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what matters." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Reeves's voice now carried a humility different from his often stoic film characters. He gestured toward Lily. "This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads." Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed from earlier. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's smile widen just a bit more. Reeves's tone grew firmer. "We're living in a time when it feels like things are pulling us apart. Differences, opinions, but faith, hope, kindness, they have the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all walking that same path in different ways." Applause began, slow at first but gaining momentum. People stood, clapping not just for Keanu Reeves, but for the moment itself, for the courage it had taken Lily to ask her question, and for the answers it had drawn out of everyone in the room. As the applause subsided, Reeves leaned in one last time. "So tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith, hope, meaning signify to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be, because it's not about knowing, it's about continuing to believe, continuing to search." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before adding, "And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow, and share it with the people who need it most." The room erupted in applause again, but this time punctuated with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope. Lily, now standing with her mother, watched Keanu Reeves step away from the podium. He walked over to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Reeves stood, giving her a faint smile before turning back to wave at the crowd as he exited. The room remained alive with chatter, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but determined. "My sister would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message was clear. Sometimes the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and hope and share it with someone who might need it today. To support the Children's Hospital, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.